Yukon Carolinas. I'm Eric.
I'm Ryan Neale.
And we are from Swordwind Historical Swordsmanship. We're a historical European martial arts group here in Charlotte. We teach the real historical use of swords from medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. And we are here to talk about very much not real swords, our beloved lightsabers. So there's a beloved form, part of Star Wars lore, which is forms of lightsaber combat, where various writers have sort of kind of tried to give a sense of what are the martial arts that Jedi actually used with their swords. This is fascinating. Everybody loves it. The bad news is that you can't do it. There's no hidden source book, no obscure copy of Star Wars Insider that actually teaches you the specific signature moves of these forms. What there is a pretty thorough description of the kind of philosophy and approach of the forms. So that is something that you can do, and in fact that you can see in kind of throughout historical sources. Like, what are we looking at, Ryan?
We're going to be looking at each of the individual forms, and basically taking the philosophy of that form and applying it as best we can, and sort of mapping it onto historical technique. And this sort of lets us be insightful about different approaches to fighting. While there are universal good approaches to fighting, there's at least a few different ways. Some defensive, some offensive, some hyper-offensive. Mm-hmm. And the Anonimo Bolognese, which is an author from our period, Anonimo because he's anonymous, he writes about you can do all of these artfully and with malice, or you could do all of them badly. And I think that with the forms, it's very much the same way. You can be defensive, aggressive, and each of these approaches mapped onto swordsmanship styles, which we will show Highland Broadsword, German Longsword, Bolognese fencing, and Eskrima Común, the common fencing of Spain, and how they sort of mesh with these ideas with the form of, like, what does it mean when this is the ferocity form and the persistence form?
Mm-hmm. Just to be clear, we're not saying that any of those forms completely map onto one of the lightsaber forms. It's not like you can say, well, Eskrima Común is exactly what Obi-Wan Kenobi was doing. Mm-hmm. Either, kind of lore-wise in your own headcanon, certainly not in any of the stage choreography in the films that we love. What you can do is look at real sword fighting and kind of pull out those attitudes that Ryan was talking about. So that's what we're going to do. Let's start diving into our forms. So now we're going to take a look at how we can apply some of those principles from real historical fencing systems to the lightsaber context. We'll start with Form 1, Shicho. Shicho is one of those hard things to describe when you come at it from a fencing perspective, because it's supposed to be just sort of the basics of swordsmanship with a steel sword. And, what does that mean? And is that really that basic? Arguably not. But Jedi seem to use Shicho to teach kind of the fundamentals of fighting with weapons. So this first technique we're going to look at is taken from a Spanish system that we call Eskrima Común, and that's Ryan's specialty. So why don't you go ahead and talk about what we're going to see?
In this action, it's one of the first actions you're taught by Master Godinho's text. It seems very straightforward and easy to foil because at an advanced level it kind of is, but his general first idea is how the cuts are done against one. And that's to walk forward, you throw tajos and reveses, like forehand and backhand cuts. Just basically kind of creating a shield in front of yourself. And if there's more than one person, you make them wider to not just to hit the opponent, but to knock his weapon out of the way and drive him back. This is a good basic technique that he builds on later for more advanced techniques with like using the bigger swords and the two swords. And also when you actually have to fence a guy and you have time to really stand still and fence and engage him, you could break out your more fancy tricks. But here, he's just covered in his book how to draw a sword and begin a fight, and now we're going to enter this combat, and we have to do it in a way that's going to keep us covered and going to put the opponent on his back heels. It's a very aggressive and simple action. It's a good way to start a system.
Notice when you watch this, guys, it's going to look like there are opportunities for me to just kind of stick my point in Ryan's face, because he's just sort of waving his sword around as he comes at me. And one of the things that this teaches you is how to really carefully dial in where you place your foot and when you are swinging, so that it may look like there's an opportunity for your opponent to just sort of like rush you, but when you're the person facing the sword swinging away in front of you, you find, I can't.
Plus in this demonstration you'll see that I have a rhythm because I'm just showing the basic version of the action. But once you have a rhythm, you could just break the rhythm. I could just be like, and then shortchange a cut, and then suddenly he's got a point in his face where he thought he had me. So it's knowing your rhythm and your distance and being able to manage that timing that is initially taught by this simple action.
So keep all that in mind, and let's take a look. For the next action, we're going to look at a pretty basic feint that comes out of a German system called Kunst des Fechtens. This is, in this action, I'm going to throw two cuts at Ryan, both kind of high horizontal, beginning with a high horizontal cut to his head, which we call the Zwerchhau. And when Ryan goes to parry that cut, because if he doesn't, I will hit him in the head, then I'm going to jump to the other side and come up into his side and his arm. And what that does is a couple of things. It gives him a real threat that makes him draw his sword out of position. And once his sword is on his left, I go and attack to his right. But I do it in a way that is going to put that it puts my sword between me and wherever his sword might be coming back from. So if this was if our swords were steel, Ryan would be bleeding and there would be a sharp barrier between me and him. Of course, with lightsabers, if he tried to come back, then he would end up just kind of shoving his arm through the plasma of my blade, which would be probably worse. So either way I'm covered. And again, we see this kind of Shicho-ish simplicity of you need to learn to move the opponent's weapon out of where they want it to be, and then exploit the opening that you've created.
And it should be said also about this technique that even though it's part of Kunst des Fechtens, which is a system of secrets early on, it's a very common German movement. This is common basic stuff that, like, this is one of the few techniques that we learn the defense to, which implies that the other person knows how to do it, which implies that it's not a secret technique. And we see it in the German common school. We see it in later sources where it winds up being described. I forget Joachim Meyer's exact quote on it, but a good portion of fencing is the Zwerchhau.
And 50% of modern fencing would go away if we didn't have the Zwerchhau.
And so this is very much sort of a basic feint. And the fact that Eric also changes levels with the feint, that he doesn't go high, makes this feint particularly crafty and effective.
Okay, so keep all of that in mind, and let's take a look. Okay, now we're going to move on to Form 2. So Form 2, Mitachi, is something that Ryan and I have pretty strong opinions on. You will its most famous practitioner is Count Dooku, who was choreographed doing a lot of one-handed stuff with his lightsaber, partially to make the character seem more elegant, and also probably because Sir Christopher Lee was a reasonably accomplished stage fencer. What makes Makashi distinctive in the lore, though, is not so much the use of one hand on the weapon as paying careful attention to where blades cross, making really minimalist, efficient movements with the lightsaber. This is what comes out of, this is supposedly the dueling form. So both sides of the Jedi Sith War have invented lightsabers, and they're starting to worry about the specifics of how do we fight somebody who's got another one of these. So the first technique we're going to look at is comes out of an Italian school that we call Bolognese, and what you're going to see is that I'm going to bait an attack out of Ryan, and then I'm just going to, with the back edge of my saber, the back edge of my saber, just sort of sweep it past my right shoulder, and that leaves my saber between Ryan and his weapon, and I can just cleave right into his face. This is something that. This is a technique that, if you do it well, looks really casual, almost arrogant, like you're just kind of walking down the street and you wave somebody's sword past and then they don't have a head anymore. But, as you want to talk a little bit about like what makes this hard to get, because we've taught this to plenty of beginners, and it's a really frustrating technique to get when you're new.
The difficulty of it is if you meet the opponent's sword force on force, that you're like your back edge, your false edge is the term that we use in Bolognese, meets it at the wrong angle, you'll just kind of get battered into the ground because they're often striking from the dominant side. You meet the strength with like a relatively weak part of your weapon that's fighting gravity, and it'll just kind of blast through. What makes this technique actually sing is that your false edge is hitting them on the flat or on the even sometimes their own false edge, depending on where you wind up. Whilst on a saber that doesn't have an edge, this still like is held in a hand. I can resist things going this way. It's harder for me to resist things trying to go against this weak link between my thumb and hand. So it's much harder for me to resist that, and plus now I kind of have to fight gravity as well as it meets, and I try to realign my weapon. And it's that sort of finding that alignment and that timing that makes this very difficult. And also overcoming that tendency to want to just make it fly out of their hand, which is not good Bolognese. In Bolognese, we have this idea of sprezzatura, that everything should look carefree, that you're an Italian nobleman and like everything should look like it takes no effort at all. And this isn't a like role-playing thing. It's what makes the system work, because you're relaxed, you're nimble on your feet, you're able to circle, which we have limited space, so we couldn't show the full circling of the footwork, but it gets very nimble in Bolognese. And also, Eric, you'll watch his feet like kind of shift so that he's able to get more behind the weapon. And this enables you to really like send that sword like on its merry way, and you get the kill.
All right, so keep all of that in mind, and let's take a look at our first Makashi technique. All right, Ryan, why don't you go ahead and introduce the second Makashi technique we're going to look at.
In this Makashi technique, we see use of economical movement, and this is so common in so many systems. And this is going to use two things. It's going to use minimal movement, and it's going to use timing. It's known as a disengage in modern fencing. In rapier, it's a cavazione, it's a sfalsata in Bolognese. But you'll notice that like Eric commits a mistake of going for my weapon instead of me while in range. There's plenty of attacks where you will knock an opponent's weapon aside. All systems have it. But in this case, he's too close. He swings for my weapon, and you notice that my weapon evades below. Again, the billion terms for it, the terms you call it changing through. I change my line of attack so that he doesn't find anything. He finds nothing but air. And in that moment, before he realizes what has gone on, I've struck him on the hand, which is a fight-ending technique. If he doesn't have a hand, he can't fight. People will talk all the time about, like, people went for lethal targets back in the day, but virtually every system tells you to try those hands first in a real fight. Then, so you'll notice that I, again, slip below, he finds air, and I don't give him time to, like, think about what he's done. It's not a 1-2. In the moment he's just realized he misses, I take my shot to the hand, and I keep myself safe. Minimum movement and a very efficient attack that will end the fight.
When you're watching this, especially pay attention to the distance Ryan mentioned. And if you like, go back and compare to that first Shicho technique, and you'll see that when Ryan was battering my sword out of the way there, he was further away from me, so that even if I tried to, like, dip below his battering attacks, I didn't have time. He wasn't right there for me to hit. Here, I've made that mistake, and I pay for it. So let's go ahead and take a look. Okay, now we're going to move on to Form 3, Soresu, the defensive form, the one that Obi-Wan Kenobi is best known for. And what Soresu is characterized by in Star Wars lore is its defensive approach. But there's a difference. There are good ways and bad ways to fight defensively. So we've taken our first technique here from Highland Broadsword, and you're going to see a number of actions that Ryan takes to keep himself safe. What are they going to see?
So while this system is predominantly designed for a sword like this that has a basket, and therefore we can get away a little more with holding our hands out, it still works pretty well with lightsabers. So what you're going to primarily see is, despite our stereotype of Highlanders as like charging angry people, which they did do on the battlefield, but still had tactics, of course, their single fighting system, their one-on-one fighting system is very conservative by many swordsmanship standards. Not only do I parry, you'll notice that my front foot I keep light so that I'm able to slip back. And this is just extra insurance to basically make sure that if he tries to feint and cut for my leg, or if I didn't quite read the attack right, that I'm out of distance in addition to my parry. This is particularly common in the Highland system. It's actually considered a distinctive, and it's mentioned in some accounts that, like, English prize fighters in later periods just didn't do this in backsword. Though that's up for debate. I'm not entirely sure on the English systems.
Although you will see in other systems telling you when you parry, you go forward.
Yes.
Bolognese, for instance, has a preference for going forward, because that way, once you have parried their attack, they can't get away from you. Of course, if you have not parried their attack, then you just walked into their sword.
And when I have my hand out in sort of this hanging guard type position, I basically am crossing where I know Eric's sword has to be when he attacks. So he makes his attack, I make that parry and I'll slip, and then I come back immediately with an attack of my own. This is called a riposte in French and modern fencing, and it's just this general idea that when you parry, you need to come back with something. There's a saying in German fencing, he who parries often finds a little joy in his art. And this idea is the fact that if you just keep parrying and parrying and parrying without presenting any threat back, like being like the ultimate defensive fighter, you're on the losing end. He has the initiative. Eventually you're going to slip up and he's going to cut you. And he knows where you're going, and he can always press you. You always have to come back with something. And so you'll notice that I'll come back immediately with a riposte to Eric.
There's oftentimes this idea in among people who talk about fans who talk about Soresu, that the true Soresu master just kind of waits for his opponent to make a mistake. Like think of the Obi-Wan versus Grievous fight, where Obi-Wan is on the defensive kind of until Grievous essentially disarms himself. That's really not the way that it works in a non-choreographed fight. So you'll notice that when Ryan hits me, we sort of established this back and forth rhythm, and then Ryan, just like he was talking about earlier, breaks the pattern, and he makes me make a mistake. He doesn't just wait for me to slip up.
Mm-hmm. And after I make that hit, I notice that still, to the end, never assume you've killed somebody. He may have, and of course he may have friends, but never assume that guy's dead. So after I hit, I come back immediately, and what's called St. George's Guard, I slip back as if, still protecting my life and defending myself at all costs. Like, there are no ties in sword fights. If I kill him, but he also kills me, I didn't exactly win that fight just because I hit him first.
So as we take a look at this, keep all of those defensive elements in mind, and let's see what it looks like. Okay, our second Soresu technique we are taking back from that German system, Kunst des Fechtens. We're going to be doing this in two hands, and this is a technique that utilize a technique called the Krumpau, or an application of the Krumpau that krumps to the flat. If we were using real swords, just like Ryan talked about in the Mikashi technique, he would be knocking my sword aside by hitting it not edge to edge, but his edge onto my flat, and just sort of opening it up. The interesting thing about this technique is that not only is he shoving my sword out of the way, he's really not opposing me force on force. It might look that way in the video. It oftentimes does from the outside, but what Ryan is doing is almost like coming on top of my sword and burying it in the ground. So as we talked about last technique, good Soresu that worked against a real person would not be just kind of waiting for them to screw up. While you are defending, you create an opening for yourself, and that's what Ryan does here when he puts his saber on top of mine, and then there's a moment where there's nothing I can do, and his blade comes up into my face. It is just a moment, so that timing piece comes in again. If he hangs out on top of my sword, there are all sorts of ways that I can slip out of that and punish him for it.
And what truly embodies in Soresu is just the patience. I have been in many tournaments where I just hang out in this particular guard, which you see called everything from Schrankhood to Eisenport, like basically barrier guard or iron gate, and just wait. And it's just such an enticing target. My hands are low, and my head is there, and I just wait. And eventually that high attack comes, and against virtually any high attack, you can just bury their sword by that crump action, the crooked hew. And this again buries their sword down, and you notice that I don't turn my edge up. That takes too much time. I just snap the false edge back, or in this case, just the blade of the lightsaber, which I don't even have to pay attention to edge alignment almost at all at that point, and cut him in the face.
Okay, so let's take a look. Our next form is Ataru, the way of the hawk bat. And if Soresu is kind of the stereotypical defensive lightsaber form, Ataru is spoken of as sort of the polar opposite. Always on the attack, always moving. This is the form that Yoda uses, flipping through the air. But it's also think about the Duel of the Fates at the end of Episode 1, and you've got Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, jumping all over the place and always kind of moving that fight around. So what are we going to see? Obviously neither of us can do backflips over each other's heads. So what does this look like in real swordsmanship?
So defending by movement alone is considered risky and chancy. It's sometimes called voiding and various other actions, just because of the fact that if you screw up your dodge, there's no steel sometimes protecting you. So this is usually considered a pretty bold action. But if you're athletic and practice it enough, you can certainly pull it off. The particular actions we're about to show are you see them in Northern Italian rapier, you see them in classical fencing, you see them in pretty modern fencing, but usually modified. And we're going to be seeing the Posada Soto, which is I basically invite to my high line, and as Eric attacks that high line, I just slip below and strike him in the body. And Jurada, where I invite to my inside line, and I void back. Awkwardly, because I'm left-handed, showing it right-handed, but nonetheless, you will see this kind of action.
Again, you're not going to see, backflips and force-assisted jumps in real swordsmanship, but notice how much Ryan is moving compared to what we've seen so far. By fencing standards, this is really extreme. So let's go ahead and take a look. Our third Ataru technique is one of Ryan's favorites, and I think it's really cool because it sort of shows how if you're moving enough, the line between offense and defense is kind of blurred. This is your specialty, so take it away.
So in Eskrima Commune, we actually have a lot of interesting stuff in this system because we have a lot of things in most systems that are one-on-one, presuming matched weapons. Eskrima Commune has that, but it also throws that out the window. And he has a lot of things for two swords or for the montante, which is a sword that's as tall as a person. Sometimes you'll hear this called a great sword or a Zweihander or things like that in fiction. And this is basically a bodyguard's weapon. I know I'm going to be outnumbered because I'm a bodyguard or I guard the flag or something important. And the way I use this weapon is I don't fence per se in the one-on-one sense with this weapon. He says just thrust with it, treat it like a spear. And in this case, I am cutting wide swaths around me and I am moving. And this particular rule is I'm in a street that's basically a crossroads. There's four corners. And this basically is to fight to each side of the road before I can get to a point where I can just run away or fight down a road. And it's basically every man for itself, need to keep moving kind of situation, because if you wind up pinned down or surrounded, you are going to die.
Yeah, in order to kind of make sure that he's defended on all sides, you're going to see Ryan, really spinning himself around essentially, which is one of those things that when you start to learn about swordsmanship, you start thinking, there are no spin moves in real life. And there are not many spin moves in real life, and almost none in one-on-one fighting. But when you are surrounded, it makes sense to be swinging that sword 360 degrees, and also to be moving your eyes 360 degrees. Those of us who can't rely on the Force need to be looking all around to keep track of our opponents. And the other thing, since I'm on sort of the losing end, let me give this perspective. It's really easy when you are looking at something like this to imagine that as soon as Ryan's back is turned, I should just rush in and hit him in the back. And indeed, if I can pull that off, that would be great. But it is a lot harder than it looks like to cross that distance in the half second or so I've got before that spinning sword is coming back again. So take a look at that. This is, in a lot of ways, this is a more common scenario for, if we imagine kind of a Jedi protagonist than the one-on-one, right? You are the Jedi, you are surrounded, and your main goal is to not be surrounded anymore. So how do you move?
And you'll see that I'll have a longer sword at one point, the actual montante, and you'll see that when I've got that much steel, it's physically hard to come in on that. Not just because of the physical, like now I've got a much bigger weapon than like anyone else on the field probably, or in the street fight is where this is, but also the psychological element of I'm coming in on this killer weapon. You have to have very fearless men to come in on this weapon as fast as I can actually move this thing at speed.
Yeah, in fact, when we get to that, you're gonna see me out of. I have left the frame because our front yard where we filmed this literally doesn't have enough room for me to be, for Ryan to be swinging that montante around and me to be anywhere near him and remotely safe. So let's take a look at our last Ataru technique. Okay, moving on to Form 5. We're going to be looking specifically at the lightsaber on lightsaber form version of Form 5 called Gemso. This is supposed to be sort of like a marriage between Soresu and Ataru, where instead of being quite so defensive as Soresu is, and instead of being quite so ballsy with our offensive movement as Ataru is, we can kind of blend them together and get the best of both worlds. So the first technique you're going to see is called the Zornhau Ort. This comes out of Kunst des Fechtens again. It is a deceptively simple technique. Ryan is going to cut at my head, and I'm going to cut back at his head, and my sword is going to end up buried in his face, and his sword is going to miss me by the left shoulder. The interesting thing from a swordsmanship standpoint is, how does that happen? Gemso is sometimes kind of caricatured in lore as being about the big, powerful strikes. But in real swordsmanship, the power of your strike is not necessarily about like putting muscle behind it. So Ryan, you are, I have no shame in saying, stronger than me. How is it that my sword hits you and your sword misses me?
This is partially sort of what we're talking about earlier, that there's a weak angle of the weapon. Like if you meet me force on force, I'm going to bury the sword in you. Partially because of just the angle, like that you move after me, that because I start and you move, I'm going to usually wind up on your flat and just smash you through your guard. But here, his sword meets me on the flat or on the short edge, to use the German term that we called false edge earlier, and this sends my sword offline, just basically dominates the center with good structure and with good extended arms. If his arms are bent, the weaker part of his sword, the part that has less leverage farther away from him, will run into the strong part of mine and he dies. If he extends it, he now puts his strong further forward. And this lets him close the line, like really dominate that center. And since neither of us have like magical ghost powers and can occupy the same spot, his sword will take that center spot, which is the quickest point to my face.
Yeah. When we do this at speed, when we do this slow, you'll see that my point sort of ends up just an inch or two away from Ryan, and I sort of lean into him. When you do it at speed, Ryan basically impales himself on my sword. This points out sort of a pet peeve of mine about lightsaber combat and people who talk about it, which is that some people have gotten this idea that kind of Makashi, the effete one-handed, manipulation-based fencing, is somehow weak against Gemso, which is strong and two-handed and battering. And the reality is that power in fencing cannot be divorced from good form and paying careful attention to the angles that your blades, intersect at. So there may be a difference in philosophy, but physically speaking, all of these things are still important. So let's take a look. Okay, our next Gemso technique involves me parrying Ryan's saber and then pushing it physically out of the way to make space for me to cut him in the head. This is taken out of Bolognese fencing, and to continue the theme that strength is not just from your muscles. You're going to see in this technique where it looks like I am just kind of shoving Ryan away with my weight, with force. What really allows me to do that is that I am not shoving his sword towards him, right? If our arms are kind of centered here and I try and push into him, I can't make him move. But if I push away from this line, from his sword to his hands to his sternum, this way, then they can move. And that's where I come back at his face. So this is an example of how, historical swordsmanship can involve this kind of what seems like strength-based shoving. But by paying attention to angles and leverage, even a weaker person can move, a stronger person or a heavier weapon out of the way, and then we come straight in with the riposte. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And now our third Gemso technique. Ryan, what are we going to see?
In this case, this particular technique comes from German common fencing, which has its own... It was a combative system, that much is true. But you also see some of the artifacts of the fencing at the time, where basically highest bleeding head wound wins. If I can get you on top of the scalp and make you bleed, and you make my cheek bleed, I win. So you see a lot of actions with the short edge that are used to, because thrusting wasn't allowed in the rules, and was kind of culturally frowned upon in earnest combat as well. You'll see me parry, and then you watch me use the baggage in kind of a clever and tricky way to basically flick on top of his head, which with a sharp or a lightsaber will kill you. So
especially with a lightsaber.
Especially with a lightsaber. So this is basically kind of a way where I keep the attack and I use my structurally strong defense. Notice I don't kind of like do this with my parry. I don't like keep the saber away from my body in a weak line. I turn in that parry and make that kind of strong triangular structure, and he's not getting through that, at least in time for me, and quick enough for me to not be able to deliver my riposte to his skull.
Yeah. If we kind of imagine what Gemso would look like in reality, I have to imagine that there'd be a lot of emphasis on making sure that your body is arranged strongly. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. Okay, we're going to move on to Form 6, Niman, which is sometimes kind of derisively referred to in Star Wars lore as the diplomat's form. This is at the time of the prequels, was what was considered state of the art. In theory, Form 6 takes the best of Forms 2, 3, 3, 4, and 5, kind of distills them into something more unified and more modern. For reasons that are not entirely clear, Star Wars lore is pretty consistent in showing this as somehow less effective than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, these guys all die in Geonosis. Like, Coleman Trebor just gets aced.
Yeah, why is that? In the real world, maybe because they had to come up with an explanation for how many Jedi died in the Battle of Geonosis.
Yeah.
The in-universe explanation is that there may be nothing wrong with the fencing itself, but just by the time of the prequels, Jedi were so focused on being diplomats and arbitrators and mediators that they didn't really practice their lightsaber skills to the extent that kind of the Jedi of old did. The one time we do see Niman spoken of highly is as a basis for Jarkai, which is the name given to all forms of double lightsaber combat, and that's what we're going to present here. So in this first technique with two sabers, we're taking this from Bolognese, and what you're going to see is me defend against a powerful two-handed high cut to my head while cutting Ryan in the side. And there are a couple of things that do show sort of like this kind of Niman balance to this technique. One is that I've got my right-hand saber entirely devoted to defending myself. So I'm not doing the kind of Asajj Ventress thing where I take both sabers and I just swing on the same line. Instead, I've got one weapon defending myself while the other one is on attack. So I'm kind of, if you want to think about it this way, I'm sort of playing Ceresu with my right hand and Ataru with my left. And this is a pretty common hallmark of historical two-sword systems, of which there are more than people think. Where if you've got two swords, you should be doing two different things with them most of the time. Ryan, anything to add before we go to the tape?
Just keep in mind, like, watch that simultaneous, that he doesn't the tendency for a beginner with two weapons is always to go block, attack. That basically is just, you may as well just have one sword then that you're just using to block, attack. The ability to block and attack at the same time is the advantage of the being doubled arms, whether it be sword and shield, two swords, sword and dagger, sword and cape, sword and bar stool, whatever you can grab at hand. That's the advantage, and that balance is what enables you to be much more effective. And it's why when people had the choice, you either put two hands on something or you have something in each hand. Like, single sword fencing historically was not common until a certain historical era, and even then it was a dueling convention.
Yeah, and it was a dueling convention precisely because it was a bad way to fight in earnest. Yeah. It's a way of kind of showing off. So let's take a look at that. So for our second Niman/Jarkai technique, we're going back to Bolognese. In the last technique, you saw me with the two sabers defending, or at least Ryan initiated, and then I defended and counterattacked at the same time. Here we take a look at something that two swords can do that one sword can't, which is that when I go to attack Ryan, I can devote an entire sword to making sure that his weapon is covered while my other hand is free to attack. This differs some from something like the Krumpau that Ryan showed earlier, where in although that is a valid and effective technique, he has to make one weapon do both, cover my sword and then hit me. And if he's slow about it, then he's going to cover my sword I'm going to slip out, and he hasn't really gained any ground. With two swords, one weapon can kind of put the opponent's saber out of action, and at the same time, the other one is coming in, and while your opponent is effectively disarmed. So let's take a look at that and see what it looks like. All right, we are coming to the end of our lightsaber forms. It is time for Form 7, Giulio, the Ferocity form, the Way of the Vornsker. We're going to take both of these from Armazare. So, Ryan, what makes these ferocious?
So Armazare, which is the martial art of Fiore de Liberi, who is a late 14th century Italian knight. His manual is notorious for starting with wrestling. He believes that wrestling is the root of all fighting. And he famously in his intro tells you about like how his wrestling is for realsies, not for play, and that you should also be beating the hell out of somebody while you do it. And Fiore has plenty of beautiful actions on the blade, but he's also kind of famous for being willing to resort to wrestling and just pressing in a bit more than our German sources are stereotyped as being. The German sources, of course, contain wrestling, but Fiore famously has a lot of actions where you're just grabbing the opponent's sword blade, which you can do. Swords, while sharp, are not lightsabers, and if they don't slide in your hand, they will not cut you.
This is a sharp sword. I can grab it just fine. And my hand is okay. I am not going to demonstrate what happens if I slide on this thing.
Yes. And so Fiore's actions that we're going to be seeing here, and both involve using either unarmed combat or another part of the sword and driving in on the opponent. And this is sort of what the ferocity is, that I just keep at you, and I know that I'm a better wrestler than you, and that I am going to kill you.
One of the things I like about this is that it is Darth Maul is the most famous user of Giulio in Star Wars canon, and of course Ray Park, being a longtime martial artist, got a lot of kicks and other kind of unarmed techniques in his fight choreography, which is awesome. One of the things you see in what you're about to see, and also in any historical source that involves wrestling or other unarmed techniques while you have a sword in your hand, is that you should never forget you have a sword in your hand. So like in this first technique, you're going to see Ryan kick out my knee, not actually, although he could. And but once that kind of collapses my structure, immediately his saber is coming in to finish the job.
And one note is that canonically this is a thing that involves grabbing the blade. Fiore shows you grabbing the sword blade before you do this. We obviously won't do that with lightsabers. So in this case, my security comes from the fact that I'm in this bind tight, that I'm kicking this knee, and if he chooses to drop his saber to attack my leg or something, that I'm just going to cleave his head off, because I'm much more guaranteed to do that with a lightsaber, feeling him leave the bind, than with a sword where it's much chancier.
Yeah. So let's take a look at that. This next technique kind of continues the theme, also taken from Armazare. Once again, Ryan and I are gonna meet with opposing cuts, and unlike in the movies, you're not gonna see us kind of get bound up in the saber lock where we're just sort of shoving against each other and insulting each other's mothers, or the sort of dramatics you tend to see in fight choreography. Instead, Ryan is just going to slip around my sword, presenting the butt of his saber, and smash my face in.
And what this sort of is, you'll notice when I do this strike, it's not just with my arms. You notice I step past him. This is a full body action. Fiore says you should be able to knock out 4 teeth with this thing. And this is, like, this can be very brutal. Even with, like, training swords against a fencing mask, which is why it's usually only shown in HEMA tournaments, is because you can really rock somebody with this. And that said, it's still not the blade of the sword. We have a German manuscript that says all parts of the sword are made for a reason. The cross, the pommel, the blade, all of it. But one of these is better at killing than the other, to say the least. And so pommel strikes are not your go-to, but when you have that kind of opportunity to just yield and the pommel's in line and that's your fastest shot, that's better than nothing.
Right. And notice, again, Ryan doesn't wait to kind of see if I give up at that point. He hits me in the face really hard, and then his saber blade is coming right back at my neck, and that's a lot worse than spitting out 4 teeth.
Yep.
So, I hope this has been interesting for you guys. Once again, we are from Swordwind Historical Swordsmanship. We teach this stuff for real from medieval and Renaissance manuscripts here in Charlotte. You can find us on the web at swordwind.org or on Facebook. And we hope to see you soon at the end of a sword or a lightsaber. Bye.